remember that if I bring the entire logo in as one piece, then it acts as one piece. It acts as one piece, even though I have the separate shells and pieces, they're all kind of together. And if I want to break them up, in other words, the abstract icon is going to do one thing, and then the text that comes in is going to do something totally different, then I want to bring them in separately. So that's the first thing you want to think about. How many people brought their logos in just by copying and pasting? So, okay, so a couple of you guys. Rest of you guys bringing it in as, okay. Rest of you, are you working off an SVG file? That's where you go right in, import, and then you could refresh and just go off the SVG?
I pasted it into the...
Okay, so you're just pasted.
Yeah.
How about the rest of you guys? Yes? No? Yours? SVG? Okay. So remember, the benefit of that is just the fact that you can actually, any changes you make will update directly into Maya, which is nice. You could do it the other way. It's not as straightforward. You have to keep on pasting it back in.
But if you bring it in via the SVG file, then it's easier to adapt.
Yeah, any changes you make and save in Illustrator, if you're saving it as an SVG, automatically updates. Okay. So, you know what? Let me just do this. I'm going to go File New. I'm going to go back to Illustrator. And everybody remembers you have to convert the text to outlines for it to come in.
How did you grab the bottom of the grid and spin it around?
Huh?
How did you grab the bottom of the grid and spin it around on Maya?
In here? You mean this?
Yeah, how you doing that?
Just Option left mouse button. So remember your navigation, Option left mouse, middle mouse, or right mouse button.
So on a PC, option is...
It would be Alt.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So let's say if I have this guy, edit, copy, and I'm just going to paste that in. And there it is there. Cool. And let's say we want to scale those so they're a little bit thicker. Now for this, if I use the Maya software, and we could see what that looks like. And Maya software or hardware are going to be the fastest renderers we have. Question?
So I did do that, but it seems like it's not coming through with Illustrator.
Did you convert it to an outline?
So I think an update happened without me knowing about it. Yeah, some sort of code subscription happened.
Creative Cloud might have updated.
So eyes up front for a second so I can show you guys basically how I'm going to set this up. And right now, the way this is set up is that if I go to SVG1, you see all of these have a path name because what I would have had to have done is go into the Illustrator file and then tell every single one of these, like if I select it and go into layers, hokey smoke, there's a lot of stuff. It's what's selected, and I would, it's funny, it's backwards. I would literally have to give each one of these a name for it to actually come over. Right? So that means I'd have to go in and you see it's like, oh, path. I'd have to say, like, give all of these a name. Otherwise, when I'm inside of here, I just have to see, like, oh, that's this one. And that's the only annoying thing is 0. Is just trying to get back into what it was. I'm just going to go repaste it. There we are. That's easier. So, I want to increase. Yeah, it's okay. So what I'd want to do, I have them all set. And I want to animate these guys maybe falling down into place, like they're kind of spiraling down and then they just fall like blocks hitting the ground, right? And if I want them to be separate, like, oh, I want T to animate this way and I want Y to animate one way and then Tot to animate a different way, then I would have brought them in separately. Okay? And that's just I would get that idea based off of my storyboard. So, but if I don't care and I'm like, no, I want them all to just kind of drop down. And I'm just going to do a quick setup here. I'm going to create a poly plane. And I'm imagining that they're going to land on this plane, this little flat surface, so that we could see them casting a shadow or something like that. And just so I could see it, I might even create a light, whether we could see with a directional light. I'll show you the differences. Directional light is a light that hits everything. It emulates like sunlight, moonlight, light source from a really far light source or really far place. And if I press, so these are some shortcut keys, so watch this. Press 4, and I see everything in wireframe mode. 5 is flat shaded. 6 is if I had textures on it, those would pop up. And then 7 is lit. But it looks kind of flat, and that's because I'd have to tell it to cast shadows inside of the lighting. So press 7 and then tell it to cast shadows, and now you'll notice it's casting shadows, see? And then depending on how I set up my light, you see that? It changes how and where the shadows are going to be cast. If I wanted more like the 20th Century Fox, I would use spotlights. And I can even animate those going across a surface. We'll get into that. One other thing I'm going to do, though, is you notice these shadows. Shadows in real life are not black. It makes it very foreboding. It's kind of creepy. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to shadows inside of my directional light. And that little box next to shadow color, I'm going to click on it. And I'm just going to give it more of a bluish, muted bluish gray tone, so it's not quite as not quite as dark, and that makes it a little bit better. And the background is still pretty black, so I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to go Create, Lights, Ambient Light. Now, this blows it up way too much by default. So I'm going to turn that down a lot, like maybe like a point. Let's try a 0.1. Oh, that's better. And it's kind of faking global illumination at this point. I could even give it a color if I wanted to.
I'm not seeing any kind of create button. Do I have to turn it on somehow?
Hold down the space bar and then go to Create. The space bar is your what they call the hot box. And the hot box are all those menus. And yeah, that'll work. Okay, so at least I could see it now. And if I were to render this in Maya software, we have this. If I were to render it in Maya Hardware 2.0, we'd have it looking just like it is in the viewport. So once again, if you remember and you have a hard time getting into that Hypershade render view, hold down your space bar and then above all the menus, left mouse click above them and hold, go to the top right, Hypershade render perspective. Okay. And that's how I get to that. Now I'm just going to color these real quick before I start animating them. Questions so far? Guys okay? Dead silence. Okay. Okay, I'm just making sure all my little settings are okay. Okay. Alrighty. So far, so good. So I'm actually going to do some overriding on these guys. And I look at how things are rendered here in my Illustrator file. So these are orange. These, I'll keep it that way. I'm going to make the interior like a silvery black. I'll make it all like a silvery black, and then these are going to be orange. And then we could just make a white background so it pops out. That also means that you guys have to think about, like, oh, if I have black letters, obviously if I have a black background, you won't be able to see them, right? So you can have black letters, but you have to have a white background so people could actually see it. So I'm going to go, and up here, I want these guys to be shiny. So I'm going to make some materials. I'm going to right-click, Create in my Hypershade. That's this area up here. So in my hypershade, I'm going to right click, create materials, and I want to create a, let's do fongs. So I'm going to create a fong, and I'll create another one. Materials, fong, and let's go for there. So the first one, I'm just going to call it orange metal matte. And I'm going to change its color to an orange, obviously. Something like that. That looks cool. And I have to assign it to these letters here. So if I go into right click and I go to face mode, I could select most of those faces. Be careful not to get the, in this case, I don't want to get the ones on the end. I just want to get the ones in the middle. And once I've selected some of them, I hold down Shift and keep hitting period to grow the selection. So it's going to grow the selection of faces that are selected and expand out to the entire object. And then I can assign that material. Right click on it, assign material to selection. And it's starting to come through. There's still a little bit of weirdness, but we'll fix that. Then the other one, for right now, I'm going to make it a darker gray. Crank up the specular color. And I'm going to put that one on, in my case, the letters on either side. So I'm grabbing some of their faces, and then Shift period to grow the selection, and then assign that to that material. And it would appear they moved it again. Doggone it. We have to tell it to ignore the actual coloring, the vertex colors on these. So what I'm going to do, actually, let's try it this way. We're just going to go mesh display, and we have to get rid let me pause this for a sec. Zoom. So I've already made the materials that I want. I'm gonna override them. So I'm gonna go into the SVG settings under texturing, and I'm gonna click on the icon all the way over here, which basically just overrides everything with its own material, and that will just clean it out. So I have it selected. I go to SVG1, texturing, and I click this icon, which just overrides the materials. Now if I go back in and do that same thing again, where I go to face, grab some of these faces, are the ones I want, shift period several times to fill it up to make sure I've got all of it, and then right click on the material I want, assign material to selection. We see, yoo-hoo, it works. See? And now I just need to do the same, in my case, for the two ending pieces. Shift period several times, which grows the selection, and then assign the black material to it. And now if I go in and I do a hardware render to it, we could see it's working, right? See? And so now that means I can go into those materials and I can tweak out their specularity. And I can do some cool stuff with them that way. I can even go into the reflected color, and I could bring in some sort of a reflection into it. Like environment textures, we see, oh, chrome, sky, all that kind of stuff. Let me just do a environment chrome. And then I can kind of change, and you'll see a little bit. Let me just show you this. I'll turn off the zoom. So do you see that little reflection that's going on? So once again, it depends. It's up to you of how you'd want to set that up. If I Z out of that, I can, and that's in the reflected color if I wanted to put some sort of a environmental sky, environmental cube. You can even have an image reflected. An HDR image would work. And some of you might wonder what the deuce an HDR image is. So actually, I'll just do HDR. So with HDR backgrounds, you can actually get, depending on how you set it up, you could potentially set up lighting and stuff that is actually going to be inside of there. So if I go in, so many, here we are. Under hdrmaps.com, there's free images you can use. It actually has a little thing called freebies. And yes, you can buy a whole bunch, but you can get these. And this will be especially important to my guys who are also in the texturing class, because we're going to use these with Arnold to light scenes. But you can actually bring these in and wrap them in around a sphere, or put them in a reflection, so that as it goes across a surface, you can see all these nice reflective details, and even light a scene based off of it, depending on how it's used. But just so that you can actually see, you know, just some of these little things that you could actually do, I would actually grab one of these, download them, and then put them in. and then I could actually utilize them. But the other thing to remember is that your highlights are going to depend on the lighting. So in other words, let me just show you this. Before I start animating this, if I create, let's say, point light, and I pull that out, check this out. Do you see this? Watch as it goes across. Do you see it has this specular highlight that goes across it?
That's nice. Yeah, that's great.
So this is a way like you could have that little ting going off of a surface. Or you could even have a spotlight. Remember, we're talking about the whole, 20th century Fox kind of deal. Where if this is my primary light source and I turn down the directional light, then I could have something like this. And if I soften it up, adjusting the penumbra angle and the drop off right here, I can make this light look a lot more realistic. So you see now it doesn't have that super hard edge. It's looking a lot more realistic, softens out. So now if I actually rotate this, you can have that effect. The 20th century thing does this, where it's like there's something like it's on a pedestal, and then they have these spotlights that are down below, illuminating it on either side, making it seem, super epic. So that you could have something like this highlighting it once it's set up. But just so you could kind of see that that idea. Crank you back up to 1. Question? Thought I saw a hand pop up. No? Okay. So I want to animate these guys, so I'm going to show you the first simple way of doing it. I select them. I go under SVG1, under Animation, and I click the Animate icon saying, yes, I want to animate you. Now, we're set right now, or should be, to 24 frames a second. And if I go to my render settings, right up here, it looks like a director's clipboard with a little gear next to it. So render settings, I'm just going to make sure I'm at presets HD 540. That'll be a decent one that we can work in that shouldn't chug it too much depending on what we're doing.
Wait, what was that?
So sure, it's this little icon all the way up at the top. And it looks like a director's clipboard with a little blue gear at the bottom right. And under the common, make sure I'm in Maya Hardware 2.0, and I'm down here, and I switched it to the preset under image size to HD 540. Okay. Next, I'm going to go all the way to the bottom right. And you should see this little fella down here. Looks like a little man with it being chased by a gear. Do you see that at the bottom right?
Yeah.
Well, not super blue.
Up here?
I'm looking for that blue ball.
No, it's, let me see if I can blow it up a little bit. You don't see this one?
Oh, it's right next to the blue ball. I got it here.
Yep, got it there. And now we're going to the little man at the bottom right. If for whatever reason you don't see it, it might be that your settings are not configured for animation. So what I want is my timeline down here and what's called my range slider. Range slider is the number, like the frames that you're looking at. Okay. So when I start playing, when you actually see this, this isn't how long the animation is, it's just the number of frames I'm looking at. My animation could be 10,000, 20,000 frames long, right? When I have that many frames, I don't want to look at all of them at once, because then it's almost impossible to fine-tune it and just adjust certain keyframes. So this is my range slider. I can grab the little boxes on either end, expand them and contract them to view certain frames, so I can focus on those, one part at a time. But what I want to do is just make sure when I go into my render, not my render settings, but my animation time slider settings, by clicking on that little guy being chased by the gear, I want to make sure that there's some things that are turned on. Height, I have set to 4x. And this is what makes it easier in the timeline. For you guys, it's not so big of a deal. You could actually, especially if you're on a smaller screen. Maya loves screens that are at least 17 inches and bigger. When you're on a 15-inch or a 13-inch, you'll notice that a lot of the menu is not visible because it really wasn't designed to work on a screen that small. So it's a little bit of a pain in the butt. You'll see menus missing, and you have to kind of push left and right or up and down to see buttons that you think should be there, and they are there. They're just pushed aside. But I'll put it to 2 right now. And it's giving me a little weirdness. We'll fix that. But I would change it through here. I want, just time display frames. That's good. That's always should be. Playback speed. You don't want play every frame. You want it to be set to 24 frames per second times 1. Okay. If this shows up as anything different than that, like 30 frames or whatever, just go to where it says settings and change it under working units to 24 frames a second. 24 FPS. The other thing I want to do is at the bottom of the time slider preferences, you'll see it says update view, active or all. And what that basically means is that sometimes you have an animation and you're viewing it from 3 or 4 or 2 different angles. Active means it'll only play the animation in the view that you have selected. All means it'll play it in all of them. It uses more resources, but it lets you see what's happening like on the back or on the side, stuff like that. So I always have it on all. And now I'm just going to hit save. And let's animate it. So I have my SVG selected. I have animation checked. And I know this is where I want it to end up. And I'm at 24 frames a second. So that means 48 frames would be 2 seconds and so on. Right? And I'm looking, these little guys, numbers at the bottom in the timeline are not seconds, they're frames. So let's say I want to make sure it's going to take a few seconds for it to come down. And I'm going to expand this out to about 200, just so that I'm viewing 200 frames. I can always change it later, you'll see. If I can't get any further, I increase the number with this little box to the right. And let's say by 2, 4, 6, 8, by 120 frames. Let's try there. So I'm going to move to a frame 120. And I'm going to hit set keys in the SVG. Boop, right there. And you notice everything should turn red inside of that box. So that means I've set a key for the translate, the rotate, and the scale that at frame 120, no matter what happens, at 120, this is where all my letters are going to wind up. Or at least start to line up, right? Now, I'm going to go back to frame 1 or 0. Let's just go to frame 0. So I'm going to change the value here and move it. So I'm at frame 0. And you remember your different axes. Translate Y is what? It's up and down, right? So I want these guys to be up, and I want them to drop down. So I'm going to go to the translate. When you see 3 boxes here, X, Y, Z, RGB or XYZ is always the 3 boxes. So if I'm looking here at translate, X, Y, Z, Y is the second value. And let's say I want to move these guys up at frame 0 to a value of 400, which means there'll be 400 units up. Right? And now I hit set keys. So watch what happens now when I hit play. You guys watching? So check it out. I hit play. And it drops down like this. Now I could speed that up and say, well, yeah, that should be a lot faster. I could also do a rotation for each of these. And I can make it a little bit more interesting. If I scroll down where it says randomize delay, I'm going to check that. And I'm just going to crank it up a little bit. And now let's just try and hit play and see what happens. Okay, like that. It's moving a little slow, so I want to speed that up. So you notice I don't see anything in my timeline. So the way I would see the keyframes that I set is by having this in my attribute editor and hitting select at the bottom of it. And now I could see these red lines, which are my keyframes. Okay? So if it's taking too long to get to 120, I'm just going to hold down Shift and left mouse drag so I could select that keyframe and then click from the center and move it. Let's say, all right, let's cut it in half. 60 frames to get there. So now if I hit play, that's better. And then I could just increase it as I go along. But any of these guys here, if I want to change, I go, oh yeah. Then let's say from here, I want these guys to kind of rotate in. And which way do I want them to rotate? I want them to kind of spin as they're dropping down. Now I've already set where they're going to wind up. I need to change where they're starting from. So X, Y, or Z. I have to decide which rotation that I want. I'm thinking Z, which would be the third one. X, Y, Z. So let me just try that. I go back to frame 0. I change the value of the third, which is the Z in the rotate, to 720. Enter and set keys. So it went to frame 0, change the value, set a key. Now let's play it and see what happens. There we go. So they're all kind of rolling in.
And for the animation tab, the rotated, would you mind dragging the mouse over the animation thing? I can't quite see it from here.
For this one or the?
The rotate.
That's the rotate there.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it on mine. Yeah, I like this, so I want to try and do it with mine also.
Did you check rotate? So if you have these three, so you're on SVG 1. And then there's the tabs here. Let me just, I'll record that again. I hit play. Check this out. You see that? So that was animating it as a whole group. They all come dropping in, and then hits, right?
And you can add music to this.
Absolutely. So here's the idea, and this is why the storyboard is so important. I want to know what I'm doing before I animate it, right? The Bob Ross happy mistakes are awesome when you don't have an end goal. You know, if I'm just doing a landscape and I just want a nice happy mistake and just things just happen, you know, that's cool. But I need this to be very, this is my plan, here's my strategy, now I execute it. It doesn't mean you can't change things, but it means that it saves you time of thinking. If you're constantly like thinking of ideas while you're doing it, I want you to imagine when in life that actually typically is a really good thing. It's rare, right? If somebody's building my house, I don't want them improvising while they're building it. You know, if somebody is doing surgery on me, I don't want them to have an epiphany of like, oh, it'd be cool if I did this and connected this to here. You know, I want there to actually be a plan and then follow. No, man, connect this to this. That's how it works. You know, so especially if you're dealing with a client, you can't have an epiphany. You have to give them what they paid for. You can come up with it as a second and say, you know what, I had an idea. Here's what you wanted, but I had this cool idea, and then run it by them. But you always have to give them what they paid for, right? And then if they like the other one, that's awesome. But don't let that be, yeah, you know that thing you paid me for and we signed a contract? Totally thrashed it. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I did. You know, I thought your medical logo needed zombies. I just thought that was an awesome thing to add to it. It's like, no, probably not. Stick to the plan.
When I hit the set key button, it's not giving me a red line on my animation timeline.
It depends on what you have selected. So if you're in the SVG, and you have this guy selected, are these guys pink?
They're red.
Okay, it means you're on a keyframe. So you hit select down here,
Okay.
and then you should see the timeline, the keyframes. That work?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's kind of interesting because these things are layered inside of each other. Okay? But if I actually start to set keys, check it out. Watch what happens when this lands now. You see that? Just by adding those little keyframes, it goes boosh. So you layer your animations. The other thing is you want to save often as multiple files. Anytime you get that idea or you're like, oh, I'm going to try this out, do a save as. Because if things go horribly wrong, you can always go back. Don't put all your eggs in one basket and then, have to redo the whole thing. Now, one person asked, how do you animate lights? Basically, the easiest way, go to your channel box, and then when I have a light, like let's say, okay, it goes right here, boom, and it's at this point that we might have this light kind of go across it, or maybe it starts off like this. Actually, we'll do it this way. We'll have these guys drop down, boom, and then I'll have a light go across it to kind of showcase the highlight, right? So I'll create a point light, because those are nice for that kind of stuff. And I'm going to put it in front over here. I'm actually going to pull it off to the side so it's not really affecting it that much. Okay. So I let it come down, boom, 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 pop. 120, it stops moving. It's kind of stretched back to what its normal state is. So at this point, I set a key for my point light. And when I press S, you'll notice it keys all the attributes in the channel box that are up top. Translate, rotate, scale. Rotate and scale mean nothing to the point light. It's a light bulb, for lack of a better description. It's a light source that's putting light out from every direction. So really, the translate's the only real important one. And now I'm going to go across and say, well, how long do I want it to take to get to the other side? So let's say 24 seconds. 1 second is going to flash by quickly. Like that. And I pull it all the way to the other side. Press S. So now, let's see what that looks like. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And I'm going to show you how to do a test render called a play blast so we could really see what it looks like. Say play. Ooh, that is quick. Let's slow that down a little bit. So, the way of slowing it down, I have the point light selected so I could see its keyframes. Shift, select that frame, and just move it over. Let's say about 45. Let's try that. See? Before you work on the next thing, get what you're working on right. Okay? If I don't, like let's say I hurry up and start doing the lights, but I haven't got the animation locked down, I'm going to have to go back in and edit my lights to match the animation. So you want to work on one thing at a time, get that stuff going right before you go to the next step. And every time I get one thing right, I probably, before I even animated the lights, should have saved a new version of this. And then I say, okay, in version 3, that's where I'm working on the lights. Version 4, blah, et cetera, et cetera.
Would you mind making the channel portion bigger? Just scrolling over that? Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'm searching for that on my laptop right here.
So the channel box is this little icon. You could just kind of go right there. Do you see this icon? It's either that or a tab. Yep, that's it. That's your channel box.
Okay, yeah, it looks a little bit different on yours.
That's because I set a key. It's pink when you set a key. It's red when you're on the keyframe. So let's everybody do a quick exercise just so we understand how keyframes work. Okay. I want everybody to create a sphere, like a polygonal ball in Maya right now. So I'm going to create, I'll give you a second to do that. I'm just going to create a polysphere. And if you want, you can create a polyplane. Ew, I'm going to have to get rid of this. Hold on. Just so I could show you how this is working. I made a polygon plane and a polygon sphere. So the plane is so I can actually have something for a little ball to bounce on. And then the sphere is the ball that's going to boing, 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 go bouncing. So make those two guys. You may also, here's the other thing. Now's a good time also to create a directional light. And remember, you could scale a directional light to any size. It doesn't matter. It just matters what direction it's going in. So you scale it up and then rotate it so you can see where the sun basically is shining. So a polyplane, a polysphere, and a directional light. Let me know if you have any problems and need any help. And we're just going to go over like setting up the keys real quick. So create lights, directional light, create polygon plane, create polygon sphere. And raise your hand if you need any help.
I already know this quick with this going.
Ah, there you go. See?
Oh, I was gonna ask you something about this thing. You said about that thing, you know, when you move the T, how did you move the T? Because I know for the SVG, I'm just curious if there's a T that you move, is it like around
T?
You know, because you move the T a little bit back and forth. Which one was it that you used to move the T?
That
just-
one.
Okay.
Z position offset. That's just moving it back and forth.
Oh, how do you move a certain one of the T?
If you name them before you exit them out of Illustrator, when you bring them in, the names will be in that box.
Okay, and then also, you said because you press a shift in the dot to make more details, like wet formula, like more pieces, and then so you can add some stuff in.
So
Oh, okay. And you add some stuff, and then you put more faces on it. Is that how you put it?
if you want to smooth it out, more
Okay. And then you said like, you know, after that you put some edit of some stuff like the shining parts or something about it.
that's the materials.
Okay. And then something added. And then, you know, we just added some stuff because this is just a vector or something. And we added something.
Well, depending on what you want to add. Do I want to add a bevel? Do I want to add other objects?
Oh, that's it?
All that kind of stuff.
That's what it is?
And now it's there. Scale it up from the center. Go left to right. That's the other way. There you go. It creates it in the center of the world.
one will cut that off of the animation is about.
Cut what off of that?
Well, this is below.
That grid does not render.
Okay, so.
The polyplane renders, but not the grid.
Right, so this grid has nothing or anything.
All it means is that you're in the world,
Yeah.
your object is tilted. It's not
It's just
fully flat. Yeah.
Okay.
But you want to stick to it when you're doing stuff because otherwise if things are like, let's say like this, then everything needs to start to move if you want the camera to be. So rather than, you don't tilt the world to fix a table that's crooked, you fix the table. You know what I mean? So,
The thing, the plane, it doesn't exist yet, right?
the polyplane does. It's just gray.
Oh, okay.
But the grid, that little wireframe grid that you always have, is just
Right.
the guide.
Okay. Ah.
You can select the plane and right click and add a new material to it if you want to change its color. But right now we're just, don't worry about it, we're just gonna, I want to show you guys how to set the keys on this guy a little bit.
So hard for me because I'm watching down at the interpreter and every time I looked up and gone across.
I'm recording it.
Yeah, just to let you know, just like in the game developers class, that whole thing just went so fast. And I was like, holy
I'm recording it, plus look at the videos I posted and the reference videos I have. And then just ask me when you have questions. Okay, guys, so when you're setting keys, first off the bat, oops, still going. So when you're setting keys, first off the bat is I'm in my channel box, which once again I could get to either by this icon right here, or there's a tab and you'll see different little menus that are here. So when I set a key that just S sets a key for everything here. Sometimes I don't want that. We'll go over that in a second, but right now, just for simplicity, I'm going to press S. So I lift my ball up because obviously if it's going to bounce, it'll start from up above first. So I go to whatever frame that I want it to start and lock it into that frame. So I'm going to go to frame 150 in my case. If you're just starting out, you'd start it at frame 0. And then I press S. And then you'll see everything turned, there's these little red icons next to everything that's been keyed. If it's this salmon color, it means the object is keyed that's selected, but you're not on a keyframe. So in other words, if I move over, you'll see it turns this salmon color. But if I go back to that keyframe, you see it turns red. I'm on a keyframe. The simplest way of, because you may want to key things outside of the whole SVG thing, the simplest way is a formula to remember how to set a key. I go to the moment in time, the frame where something is supposed to happen. I move the object into the position or place of what it's happening. I press S. Now I go a few frames ahead to when I want the next thing to happen. In this case, I'm going to move my ball down to the ground. So go to the frame, move the object, press S. Now I'll go a few frames more, move the object, press S, a few frames more, go to the object, put it in the position it's supposed to be, press S. If you don't do it in that sequence, it doesn't work right. So I have to say, at this moment in time, you're going to be doing this. At this moment in time, you're going to be doing this. And then I lock it down with the keyframe. So boom, boom. And I just continue.
Let me play with that.
Mm-hmm. So imagine if I designed this differently and that ball falling down was like the dot of an eye. And after this text lays out, the eye just bounces right on and then sticks into place. If that were the case, I would have left the dot out of the logo and then just put it in Maya.
Thank you so much.
And then I'll post that. So I'm going to stop this. Great. Polygon cube. So let's say this is the house. I'll just turn this off because we don't need it. You're right there. So, mesh display,
Okay.
reverse. And then display.
So, but when I do that, mine turns black all around
Yep,
it.
that's supposed to.
Okay.
Display, polygons, backface culling.
Got it. Can you use that into games? Can you put that
Games
into
already
games?
do it.
Because I was trying to put it into the game and it wasn't working.
Games already do that. It depends on what game engine. Like, I haven't used Unity in a long time. I really need to get up on it. But Unreal, when I drop something in, it automatically does that.
Okay.
You do have to reverse the normals if it's for an interior.
Okay.
But by default, in most game engines that I've seen, don't have double-sided surfaces turned on the way Maya does. You have to apply a material that tells it to be double-sided.
Okay.